Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport truck, her boots hitting the dusty ground of Camp Resolute with a solid thud. The NATO training facility stretched before her like a small city of olive green tents and concrete buildings, buzzing with the constant activity of soldiers from different nations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound, and the air smelled of diesel fuel and determination. She adjusted her gear bag on her shoulder and took a deep breath. At 26, Sarah had already served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a helicopter pilot, but this assignment felt different. The Advanced Combat Training Program at Camp Resolute was known for breaking even the toughest soldiers. Only the best of the best made it through the 12-week course that combined ground combat, survival training, and specialized operations. Fresh meat, someone called out from a group of soldiers near the barracks. Sarah turned to see 5 men in various military uniforms watching her with amused expressions. The one who had spoken was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the insignia of a British SAS operative. His name tag read Morrison. "Look at this," Morrison continued, nudging his companion, a stocky German paratrooper named Klaus. "They're sending us babysitters now. What's next, a kindergarten teacher?" Sarah kept walking, her face expressionless. She had heard worse during her time in the service, and she knew better than to rise to the bait on her first day. But the comments followed her as she made her way toward the registration building. "I give her 2 days before she's crying to go home," laughed a French Foreign Legion soldier with a thick accent. 2 days, scoffed an Italian Marine. "I say she quits before the first training exercise." The registration process was quick and efficient. Sarah received her bunk assignment, meal schedule, and training roster from a no-nonsense sergeant who barely looked up from his paperwork. Her quarters were in Barracks C, a long, low building that housed 36 trainees in cramped but functional accommodations. As she pushed open the heavy door, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The barracks fell silent except for the hum of industrial fans fighting against the desert heat. 35 pairs of eyes followed her as she located her assigned bunk near the back of the room. Her neighbors included a Norwegian Special Forces operator who immediately turned his back to her, and a Canadian sniper who shook his head in apparent disgust. "Great," muttered the Canadian under his breath. "Now we have to watch out for civilians during training." Sarah set down her gear and began unpacking methodically. She hung her few civilian clothes in the narrow locker, arranged her toiletries on the small shelf, and placed a single framed photograph on the metal nightstand. The photo showed her standing next to a Black Hawk helicopter, helmet tucked under her arm, with 3 other crew members who had become like family during their deployment. "Nice picture," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a lean man with dark hair and intelligent eyes. His accent was unmistakably American, and his bearings suggested military experience. "I'm Jake Russo, Army Rangers. You must be the pilot everyone's talking about." "Sarah Martinez," she replied, extending her hand. Jake shook it firmly, and she appreciated that he didn't comment on her grip or make any of the usual remarks about female soldiers. "Word of advice," Jake said quietly, glancing around the barracks. "Don't let them get to you. Half these guys are here because they couldn't cut it in their regular units. The other half are just trying to prove something to themselves." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp whistle pierced the air. "All trainees report to the parade ground in 5 minutes," boomed a voice over the camp's loudspeaker system. "Full gear. Move it." The barracks erupted into organized chaos as 36 soldiers grabbed their equipment and rushed for the door. Sarah shouldered her pack and followed the crowd outside, where the afternoon heat hit her like a physical blow. The parade ground was a large, flat area of packed dirt surrounded by training facilities and obstacle courses that looked designed by someone with a cruel imagination. Standing at attention in the center of the parade ground was the most intimidating group of instructors Sarah had ever seen. There were 8 of them, each representing a different military tradition and specialization. At their center stood a man who commanded attention without saying a word. He was tall, but not huge with graying hair and steel blue eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness in the assembled trainees. His uniform bore no national insignia, but his bearing screamed special operations. "I am Colonel Anderson," he said, his voice carrying easily across the parade ground without seeming to be raised. "For the next 12 weeks, your previous ranks, your previous accomplishments, and your previous opinions about your own capabilities are irrelevant. Here, you are all equally worthless until you prove otherwise." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group, but Colonel Anderson's expression didn't change. "You think that's funny? Let me explain something. Of the 36 people standing here today, maybe 8 will complete this program. The rest will quit, be injured, or simply fail to meet our standards. The question isn't whether you're tough enough to be here. The question is whether you're smart enough to survive what's coming." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat. Around her, she could sense the other trainees shifting uncomfortably as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "You will be tested in every way imaginable," Colonel Anderson continued. "Physical endurance, mental resilience, tactical knowledge, and leadership under pressure. Some of you will discover strengths you never knew you had. Others will learn that your perceived strengths were actually weaknesses in disguise." He began walking slowly along the front rank of trainees, his eyes meeting each person's gaze for a brief, uncomfortable moment. When he stopped in front of Sarah, she felt as though he was looking straight through her. "Martinez," he said, reading from a tablet one of his assistants handed him. "Helicopter pilot, 3 combat deployments, exceptional service record." He paused, and Sarah could feel 35 other trainees listening intently. "Tell me, pilot, what makes you think you can handle ground combat operations?" The question was clearly designed to put her on the spot, to make her defensive or boastful in front of her peers. Sarah had faced similar challenges before, and she knew the best response was simple honesty. "I don't know if I can, sir," she said clearly. "That's why I'm here to find out." Something that might have been approval flickered in Colonel Anderson's eyes, but his expression remained neutral. He continued down the line, asking pointed questions of other trainees that revealed their insecurities and motivated their presence at the camp. When he finished his inspection, Colonel Anderson returned to the center of the formation. "Your first exercise begins at 0500 tomorrow. It will be a 20-mile march in full gear, followed by weapons qualification, followed by a survival exercise that will last 3 days. Some of you won't make it past the march. Others will tap out when you realize you'll be eating insects and drinking muddy water to stay alive." He paused to let that information sink in. "Dinner is at 1800 hours. Lights out at 2200. I suggest you use the time between now and then to get to know your equipment and say goodbye to whatever comfort you think you're entitled to." Dismissed. As the trainees dispersed, Sarah noticed the looks and whispered comments that followed her. The skepticism was obvious, but she had expected that. What surprised her was the mix of curiosity and outright hostility in some of the expressions. A few soldiers seemed genuinely interested in seeing what she could do, but others appeared personally offended by her presence. The mess hall was a large, functional space filled with long tables and the kind of institutional lighting that made everything look slightly unappetizing. Sarah got her tray of food, some kind of meat, potatoes, and vegetables that all shared the same brownish color, and looked for a place to sit. Most of the tables were already occupied by small groups of soldiers who had clearly begun forming alliances and friendships. As she approached one table with empty seats, the conversation stopped, and the occupants suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The same thing happened at the next table, and the next. Finally, Jake Russo waved her over to a table near the back where he was sitting with 2 other soldiers. "Sarah, meet Tony Chun and Alex Petrov," he said as she set down her tray. Tony was a compact Asian-American man with the confident bearing of a Marine Force recon operative. Alex was a tall, quiet Russian with pale eyes and hands that moved with the precision of a sniper. "So," Tony said after she had taken a few bites of the unidentifiable meat, "what's your story?" "Most pilots I know are perfectly happy staying in the cockpit where it's safe. Sarah appreciated the direct question. I've spent 3 years flying support missions, watching ground troops do the dangerous work while I stayed in the air. I wanted to understand what they go through, to be able to do more than just provide transport and cover fire. Alex nodded slowly. Respect, he said in accented English. Most people want easier jobs, not harder ones. Their conversation was interrupted by loud laughter from across the mess hall. Sarah looked over to see Morrison, the British SAS soldier from earlier, entertaining a large table with what appeared to be an animated story. His voice carried clearly across the room. So there we were, completely surrounded by Taliban fighters in this village outside Kandahar. Morrison was saying, our pilot, some fresh-faced kid who'd probably never been shot at, was supposed to extract us from the LZ. But when the shooting started, guess what happened? Several soldiers leaned forward, clearly engaged in the story. The bloody pilot panicked and flew off, left us to fight our way out on foot. Took us 18 hours to reach the backup extraction point. 3 men wounded, 1 nearly bled out, all because our flyboy couldn't handle a little ground fire. Morrison's eyes found Sarah across the room, and his smile turned cold. Point is, there's a reason pilots stay in the air. They don't have the stones for real combat. The mess hall had grown quiet, and Sarah realized that many of the other trainees were watching to see how she would respond. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the assumption that she would either retreat in embarrassment or rise to Morrison's bait with an angry outburst. Instead, she took another bite of her dinner and continued eating as if nothing had happened. After a moment, conversations resumed around the room, though she could feel occasional glances in her direction. That was well played, Jake said quietly. Morrison's trying to get under your skin, make you do something stupid. I figured, Sarah replied. He'll have plenty of opportunities to see what I can do over the next 12 weeks. No point in wasting energy on words. But as she finished her meal and prepared for her first night in the barracks, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison's story had been more than just casual trash talk. There had been something personal in his tone, a genuine anger that went beyond simple hazing of a new trainee. Back in the barracks, the atmosphere was tense as soldiers prepared their gear for the next day's march. Sarah methodically checked her equipment, making sure everything was properly secured and easily accessible. Her pack weighed exactly 45 pounds, within regulation, but still heavy enough to become a serious burden over 20 miles of desert terrain. As lights out approached, the conversations grew quieter, but Sarah could still hear whispered discussions about tomorrow's challenges. Some soldiers were clearly nervous, others excited, and a few seemed grimly determined to prove themselves at any cost. Morrison's voice drifted from the other side of the barracks, speaking to his growing circle of followers. Mark my words, he was saying, some people are going to learn very quickly that they don't belong here. And when they do, they'd better have the decency to quit before they get someone else hurt. Sarah pulled her blanket up to her chin and stared at the dark ceiling. In less than 8 hours, she would face her first real test at Camp Resolute. Everything she had accomplished in her military career, all the respect she had earned and confidence she had built, meant nothing here. She was starting over from zero, and 35 other soldiers were waiting to see her fail. But as she closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the barracks settling into uneasy sleep, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement about a challenge. Tomorrow would reveal who belonged at Camp Resolute and who didn't. She intended to be in the first group, regardless of what Morrison or anyone else thought about pilots and ground combat. The last thing she remembered before falling asleep was the feeling of the small tattoo on her left shoulder blade, hidden beneath her uniform shirt. It was a design most people wouldn't recognize, but for those who knew its meaning, it told a very different story about Sarah Martinez than the one her personnel file contained. Tomorrow, she thought drowsily, will be interesting indeed. The alarm blared at 0430 hours, jolting Sarah from a deep sleep. Around her, the barracks erupted into controlled chaos as 36 soldiers scrambled to prepare for what promised to be a grueling day. Sarah had been awake for several minutes before the alarm, her internal clock still adjusted to the early wake-up calls of her previous deployment. She moved efficiently through her morning routine, noting how some trainees were already showing signs of stress. A few fumbled with their gear, while others sat on their bunks, staring blankly at their equipment, as if unsure where to begin. Morrison, she noticed, was dressed and ready with military precision, but his followers seemed to be struggling to match his pace. The mess hall served a quick breakfast of oatmeal, fruit, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the bitter sludge she had expected. Sarah ate mechanically, focusing on fueling her body rather than enjoying the meal. Around her, conversations were muted and tense. 20 miles in this heat, muttered Klaus, the German paratrooper, as he stirred sugar into his coffee. In full gear, no less. Some of these pretty boys are going to be crying for their mothers by mile 10. The heat's not the worst part, said Alex Petrov, joining their table with his breakfast tray. It's the terrain. I studied the maps last night. The route takes us through some seriously rough country. Rocky hills, sand pits, a few creek beds that'll be muddy from yesterday's rain. Tony Chin nodded grimly. Plus, they're not just testing our endurance. They'll be watching how we work together, who helps struggling teammates, who tries to push ahead alone. Everything we do is being evaluated. At 0500 sharp, Colonel Anderson's voice boomed across the parade ground. Form up in columns of 4. Full packs, weapons, and water. You have 30 seconds. Sarah fell in a line with Jake, Tony, and Alex, grateful to be surrounded by soldiers who seemed competent and level-headed. Behind her, she could hear Morrison's group making crude jokes about the upcoming march, their bravado perhaps masking their own nervousness. Colonel Anderson appeared before them, wearing full gear, looking as fresh and untroubled as if he were about to take a casual stroll. The route is marked with orange flags, he announced. 20 miles through varied terrain, ending at Grid Point Charlie, where you will establish a temporary camp. Any trainee who falls more than half a mile behind the main group will be considered a failure. Any trainee who abandons their assigned equipment will be considered a failure. Any trainee who requires medical evacuation will be considered a failure unless the injury was caused by factors beyond their control. He paused to let those rules sink in. The march begins now. Move out. The first 5 miles pass through relatively flat desert terrain, and Sarah found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm. The early morning air was cool, though she could already feel the promise of punishing heat in the rising sun. Her pack felt manageable, and her legs remembered the steady pace that had carried her through countless training exercises. Around her, the formation began to spread out naturally as soldiers found their preferred positions and walking partners. Morrison's group pushed toward the front, clearly trying to establish themselves as the pace setters. A few trainees were already struggling, their breathing labored, and their pace becoming erratic. "Doing okay back there, pilot?" Morrison called over his shoulder as his group passed Sarah's column. "Don't worry if you need to slow down. We'll send someone back to check on you." Sarah didn't respond, but Jake muttered something unflattering under his breath. "Guy's trying way too hard," he said quietly. Real professionals don't need to announce how tough they are. By mile 8, the terrain had become significantly more challenging. The marked route led them up a series of rocky hills that required careful footing and constant attention to balance. The weight of their packs became more noticeable as they climbed, and several trainees were beginning to fall behind. Sarah noticed that Morrison's aggressive pace was starting to take its toll on his followers. Klaus was breathing heavily, and 2 of the others were beginning to stumble on the loose rocks. But Morrison himself seemed unaffected, pressing forward with the kind of determination that came from either exceptional fitness or stubborn pride. "We should help them," said Tony, nodding toward a Norwegian soldier who was clearly struggling with the heat and altitude. "Agreed," said Alex. Without discussion, their small group slowed their pace to match the struggling trainees, offering encouragement and sharing some of their water when he began to look dangerously dehydrated. "Martinez!" Morrison's voice carried back from ahead. "Stop coddling the weaklings. This isn't a charity march." Colonel Anderson, who had been moving up and down the formation like a shadow, appeared beside them, as if from nowhere. "Problem here?" he asked mildly. "No, sir," Sarah replied. "Just maintaining unit integrity." The colonel studied her for a moment, then looked at the Norwegian soldier, who was now walking steadily with the support of the group. "Carry on," he said, and disappeared back into the formation. The middle section of the march proved to be the most challenging. The route descended into a series of creek beds and sandy washes that had been turned into mud pits by recent rain. Each step required extra effort to pull boots free from the sucking mud, and the uneven footing made it impossible to maintain a steady rhythm. Several trainees fell during this section, covering themselves in thick, stinking mud that added weight to their already heavy packs. Sarah watched one soldier from the Italian contingent go down hard, his ankle twisting as he tried to avoid a particularly deep mud hole. "I'm fine," the soldier insisted as medics appeared to evaluate his injury. But his face was pale with pain, and when he tried to stand, he immediately collapsed again. The medical team called for extraction, and he was loaded onto a stretcher with tears of frustration in his eyes. "That's one down," Morrison announced loudly. "Who's going to be next?" His comments sparked angry mutters from several trainees, but most were too focused on their own struggles to respond. The mud had claimed 3 more casualties by the time they reached solid ground again. One with a knee injury, another with what appeared to be heat exhaustion, and a third who simply sat down in the mud and refused to continue. By mile 15, the formation had stretched out considerably. Morrison's reduced group was still in the lead, but their earlier aggressive pace had cost them dearly. Klaus had dropped back to join a slower group, and 2 others were being supported by teammates who shared the weight of their equipment. Sarah's group had settled into a steady, sustainable pace that kept them in the middle of the formation. The Norwegian soldier they had helped earlier was now walking strongly on his own, and had proven to be excellent company during the long, monotonous stretches of desert walking. "You know," said Jake, wiping sweat from his forehead, "I'm starting to think this isn't really about the 20 miles. "What do you mean?" asked Tony. "Look around. Anderson and his staff are everywhere, watching everything we do. They're not just checking our endurance. They're studying how we react under pressure, how we treat teammates, how we handle unexpected challenges." Sarah nodded, having had similar thoughts. It's a leadership evaluation disguised as a fitness test. They want to see who breaks down, who steps up, and who works well with others. The final 5 miles tested everyone's reserves. The sun was now high and merciless, turning their uniforms into sweat-soaked rags and making every step feel like a small victory. Water became precious, and Sarah noticed that those who had been generous with their supplies earlier were now being repaid by teammates who shared their remaining water. Morrison's group, which had been so vocal earlier, was now silent with exhaustion. Morrison himself was still moving strongly, but his followers were scattered across several hundred yards of trail, some barely managing to put one foot in front of the other. "Come on, you bloody weaklings," Morrison called back to them. "We're almost there." But his encouragement sounded hollow, and Sarah could see that his leadership style was based more on intimidation than inspiration. When one of his original followers stumbled and fell, Morrison barely paused to check on him before continuing forward. The contrast was stark when compared to other groups that had formed during the march. Sarah watched a group of Eastern European soldiers working together to help a teammate who was suffering from cramps, taking turns carrying his pack and making sure he had enough water. Another group had developed a rotating system where the strongest members set the pace at the front while others provided encouragement and support from behind. As they approached the final checkpoint at Grid Point Charlie, Sarah could see a cluster of tents and vehicles in the distance. The sight should have been encouraging, but she knew that completing the march was only the first part of their day. According to the schedule, they had weapons qualification immediately after arrival, followed by the start of the 3-day survival exercise. Colonel Anderson was waiting at the finish line with his clipboard and stopwatch. As each trainee crossed the marked boundary, he made notes and directed them toward different areas of the camp. Sarah's group finished in the middle of the pack, tired but still functional. Not bad, pilot, Morrison said as he passed them on his way to the weapons range. But walking is the easy part. Let's see how you do when someone's shooting back. The weapons qualification took place at a range that had been carved into the side of a small hill. Targets were positioned at various distances and angles, some stationary and others programmed to move unpredictably. Each trainee had to demonstrate proficiency with their primary weapon, sidearm, and at least one crew-served weapon. Sarah had always been a competent marksman, but she knew that her scores would be average compared to soldiers whose primary job involved direct combat. What she hadn't expected was how much the morning's march would affect her performance. Her hands were slightly unsteady from fatigue, and her breathing was still elevated from the long walk in the heat. Her first magazine was disappointing. Several shots that should have been center mass hits were instead scattered around the outer rings of the targets. She took a deep breath, forced herself to relax, and focused on the fundamentals her instructors had drilled into her years earlier. The second magazine was much better. Her shots grouped tightly around the target centers, and her final score put her in the top third of the remaining trainees. Not spectacular, but respectable. Morrison, she noted, shot with the kind of precision that came from extensive combat experience. His targets looked like they had been worked over by a machine rather than a human shooter. Several other trainees also demonstrated exceptional marksmanship, reminding Sarah that she was competing against some of the world's most elite soldiers. But marksmanship was only part of the evaluation. The instructors were also watching how each trainee handled their weapons, followed safety protocols, and adapted to different firing positions and conditions. Sarah saw several technically proficient shooters receive lower scores because they were careless about muzzle discipline or failed to properly clear their weapons between exercises. As the sun reached its peak, Colonel Anderson gathered the surviving trainees, now down to 31 after the March casualties, for a briefing on the survival exercise. "You will be divided into groups of 5, he announced. Each group will be dropped at a different location within a 10-square-mile area. Your mission is to reach the extraction point." He pointed to a spot on a large map. "Within 72 hours, using only the equipment you can carry and what you can find or make from the environment." Sarah felt a knot of anticipation in her stomach. Survival training had been part of her pilot qualification, but it had focused primarily on evading capture and waiting for rescue. This exercise sounded much more demanding. Each group will receive a basic survival kit containing one knife, one length of rope, waterproof matches, and a single MRE. Everything else you will need to procure for yourselves. You will be monitored by hidden observers, but they will not assist you unless there is a genuine medical emergency. The group assignments were announced, and Sarah was relieved to find herself paired with Jake, Tony, Alex, and, surprisingly, Klaus, the German paratrooper who had struggled during the march but had shown good teamwork in helping other soldiers. Morrison's group consisted entirely of his original followers, minus those who had been eliminated during the march. Sarah noticed that he seemed pleased with the arrangement, probably viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership without having to work with soldiers he considered inferior. "One final point," Colonel Anderson said as the groups prepared to board the transport vehicles that would take them to their starting positions. "This exercise is not just about survival skills. We will be evaluating leadership, decision-making, adaptability, and team cohesion. Individual heroics will be viewed less favorably than effective group performance." As Sarah climbed into the back of the military truck that would transport her group to their starting point, she caught sight of her reflection in the vehicle's side mirror. She looked tired but determined, covered in dust and sweat from the morning's march. But there was something else in her expression, a confidence that came from knowing she had already exceeded some people's expectations. The truck ride took them deeper into the desert, over roads that gradually became tracks, and finally to locations that seemed to have no roads at all. When they finally stopped, Sarah looked out at a landscape of rocks, scrub brush, and endless blue sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and it would be their home for the next 3 days. "Good luck," said the driver as he handed them their basic survival kit. "See you at the extraction point." Hopefully, as the truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving them alone in the vast emptiness of the desert, Sarah felt the weight of the challenge ahead. The march had been difficult, but it had been a known quantity, put one foot in front of the other for 20 miles. This was different. This would require skills, creativity, and teamwork that she wasn't sure she possessed. But as she looked at her 4 teammates, each of them taking in their surroundings and beginning to discuss their options, she felt a spark of optimism. They had all made it through the first day's tests, and they each brought different strengths to the group. If they could work together effectively, they might just surprise everyone, including themselves, with what they could accomplish. The real test, Sarah realized, was just beginning. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by scattered rock formations and the occasional stubborn bush clinging to life in the harsh landscape. Sarah's team stood in a loose circle, studying their map and the sparse survival kit they had been given. The truck that had brought them was already a distant speck, leaving them truly alone for the first time since arriving at Camp Resolute. "Right," said Jake, unfolding the map completely. "We're here." He pointed to a spot marked with red ink, and "we need to reach the extraction point here, about 8 miles northeast." 72 hours to cover 8 miles doesn't sound too challenging until you factor in finding food, water, and shelter. Alex knelt beside him, studying the terrain features marked on the map. "There's a creek marked about 3 miles north of here, but with this heat, it might be dry." These elevation lines suggest some decent shelter possibilities in those rocks to the east. Klaus wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at their meager supplies. 1 MRE between 5 people for 3 days. "That's going to be interesting." "Water's the real priority," said Tony. "We can survive 3 days without food if we have to, but in this heat, dehydration will kill us faster than hunger." Sarah had been quietly studying their surroundings while the others discussed logistics. Something about the terrain looked familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. The rock formations and the way the land sloped toward what appeared to be a dry riverbed triggered a memory from one of her aerial missions. "I think I know where we are," she said, causing the others to look up from their planning. "If I'm right about our location, there's a series of pools about 2 miles northwest of here. They're fed by an underground spring, so they should have water even in dry weather." Jake frowned at the map. "I don't see any water source marked in that direction." "It wouldn't be," Sarah explained. "The pools are hidden in a canyon that's only visible from above. I flew over this area during a reconnaissance mission about 18 months ago. The water source isn't marked on standard maps because it's considered tactically significant." The group exchanged glances. Finding reliable water on their first day would be a huge advantage, but it would mean trusting Sarah's memory and possibly wasting precious time and energy if she was wrong. "How sure are you?" asked Alex. Sarah considered the question carefully. 70%. "The terrain features match what I remember, but I was seeing it from a helicopter at 1,000 feet. Things look different from ground level." Klaus stood up and shouldered his small pack. 70% is better odds than we'll get from anything else in this desert. "I say we go for it." The others agreed, and they set off northwest across the broken terrain. The sun was now at its peak, turning their march into a slow battle against heat that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. They conserved their water carefully, taking small sips only when absolutely necessary. After an hour of walking, Tony called a halt. "We need to be smarter about this," he said, finding a narrow strip of shade beside a large boulder. "Walking in the open sun during the hottest part of the day is burning through our energy reserves too quickly. We should rest until late afternoon, then travel during the cooler hours." It was sound advice, and they settled into the minimal shade to wait out the worst of the heat. Jake used the time to study their route in more detail, while Alex began fashioning a simple snare from part of their rope and some wire from his gear. Klaus, despite his struggles during the morning march, proved surprisingly knowledgeable about desert survival techniques. In Afghanistan, Klaus explained as he showed them how to create a solar still from their empty water bottles. "We had to survive in similar conditions during a mission that went wrong. The key is not fighting the environment, but working with it. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about Morrison's team and wondering how they were handling their own survival challenge. Morrison was undoubtedly skilled and experienced, but his leadership style during the march had been more about personal dominance than team building. She was curious to see whether that approach would be effective in a situation that required genuine cooperation. Around 4 o'clock, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they resumed their trek toward the hidden pools. The terrain became increasingly rugged as they climbed toward what Sarah hoped was the correct canyon. Her confidence began to waver as they encountered several false leads, small ravines that looked promising from a distance, but led nowhere. "There," she said finally, pointing toward a narrow gap between 2 tall rock faces. "That has to be it." The gap was barely wide enough for a single person to pass through, and it required some careful scrambling over loose rocks to reach. But as they pushed through the narrow entrance, they were rewarded with the sight of a hidden canyon containing 3 clear pools of water surrounded by green vegetation. "Outstanding," breathed Jake as they hurried toward the nearest pool. The water was crystal clear and surprisingly cool, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep underground. They filled their water bottles and drank deeply, feeling immediate relief from the dehydration that had been building throughout the day. "This changes everything," said Tony, looking around at the sheltered canyon. "We've got reliable water, natural shelter from the wind, and enough vegetation to support some wildlife." As if to prove his point, Alex's improvised snare caught a small rabbit within an hour of being set up. They had been debating whether to risk a fire when Sarah suggested an alternative. "Hot rocks," she said, pointing to the flat stones that had been baking in the desert sun all day. "We can cook the meat on heated stones without creating smoke that might give away our position." The technique worked perfectly, and they enjoyed their first real meal since breakfast. The rabbit provided much-needed protein, and they supplemented it with edible plants that Klaus identified growing near the water source. As darkness fell, they established a watch schedule and settled in for their first night in the desert. Sarah took the second watch from midnight to 2 a.m. The desert night was surprisingly cold after the brutal heat of the day, and she wrapped herself in an improvised blanket made from their rope and some canvas from their gear. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional sound of small animals moving through the canyon. As she sat guard, Sarah found herself thinking about the events of the past 2 days. The march had tested their physical endurance, the weapons qualification had measured their technical skills, and now this survival exercise was evaluating their ability to work as a team under extreme stress. But she sensed that there was another level to these tests, something the instructors were looking for beyond basic military competencies. She was pulled from her thoughts by the sound of voices echoing faintly through the canyon. At first, she thought it might be another team of trainees, but as the voices grew closer, she realized they were speaking in English with accents she recognized. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, Sarah crept toward the canyon entrance and positioned herself where she could observe the narrow gap they had used to enter. After several minutes, she saw them, Morrison and 3 members of his team, moving through the desert with what appeared to be professional night vision equipment. That was odd. The survival exercise was supposed to test their ability to operate with minimal equipment, but Morrison's team seemed to have gear that wasn't part of the standard issue. Sarah watched as they stopped near the canyon entrance, apparently following some kind of trail or signal. "The tracks lead this way," she heard Morrison say quietly. "At least 5 people moving northwest from the drop point. If they found water, they'll have stopped somewhere in this area." One of his teammates, a man Sarah recognized as a French Foreign Legion operative, studied the ground with a small red-filtered flashlight. "Fresh signs here. They passed through within the last few hours." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert cold. Morrison's team wasn't just trying to survive in the desert. They were actively tracking other teams. That wasn't part of the exercise they had been briefed on, which meant either Morrison had information the others didn't, or he was operating outside the established rules. She watched as the 4 men continued past the hidden canyon entrance, apparently missing the narrow gap in the darkness. But their presence raised serious questions about what was really going on in this exercise. If Morrison had special equipment and was hunting other teams, it suggested that there was a competitive element to the survival test that hadn't been explained to the participants. Sarah waited until Morrison's team was well out of sight before returning to wake Alex for his watch. She briefly considered telling him about what she had observed, but decided to wait until morning when she could discuss it with the entire team. For now, their water source and shelter remained secret. The next morning brought new challenges. Their hidden canyon had provided excellent protection for the night, but they needed to continue moving toward the extraction point. The question was whether to stay hidden in their secure location or risk traveling during daylight when other teams might spot them. "We're ahead of schedule," Jake pointed out as they studied their map over a breakfast of roasted roots and spring water. "We could stay here another day and travel to the extraction point tomorrow night." "But we'd be cutting it close," argued Tony. "If something goes wrong, if someone gets injured or we encounter bad weather, we won't have any buffer time." Sarah made her decision. "I saw Morrison's team last night," she said, and quickly explained what she had observed. "They have equipment they shouldn't have, and they're tracking other teams. I think there's more to this exercise than we were told." The revelation sparked an intense discussion about their options. Klaus suggested that they should report Morrison's apparent rule violations to the exercise controllers, but Alex pointed out that they had no way to contact the observers and no proof of what Sarah had seen. Besides, Alex added, maybe this is part of the test. Maybe they want to see how we react when we discover that other teams are operating under different rules. In the end, they decided to continue toward the extraction point, but to travel more cautiously and be prepared for the possibility that they might encounter other teams who viewed them as competition rather than fellow trainees. They left their canyon shelter in the early afternoon, after spending several hours creating false trails and covering their tracks as much as possible. The terrain between their water source and the extraction point was more open than the route they had traveled the previous day, offering less concealment, but easier walking. About halfway to their destination, they encountered their first sign of another team. Tony spotted the remains of a small fire in a sheltered area between two large rocks. The ashes were still warm, indicating that another group had camped there recently. "Professional work," commented Jake as he examined the fire site. They used dry wood to minimize smoke, built it in a location that would be invisible from most directions, and cleaned up their campsite before leaving. Sarah knelt beside the ashes and found something interesting, a small piece of cloth that appeared to have been deliberately left behind. When she examined it more closely, she realized it was a fragment of German military uniform with Klaus's unit patch on it. "Someone's trying to make it look like we were here," Klaus said grimly when Sarah showed him the evidence. "That's not an accident." The implications were troubling. If someone was deliberately planting false evidence to confuse the tracking, it suggested that the competition between teams was more serious than they had realized. It also meant that they might be blamed for activities they hadn't engaged in. They pressed on toward the extraction point, now moving with the heightened awareness of soldiers who knew they might be operating in hostile territory. The landscape gradually changed as they approached their destination, becoming more hilly and offering better concealment. As they crested a ridge about a mile from the extraction point, Sarah spotted movement in the valley below. Using the small binoculars from their survival kit, she identified two teams of trainees moving toward the same destination from different directions. One team she didn't recognize, but the other was clearly Morrison's group. They were moving with military precision in a tactical formation that suggested they expected contact with enemy forces rather than a simple survival exercise. "Something's not right," said Alex, taking his turn with the binoculars. "Look at how they're moving. That's an assault formation, not a group of tired, hungry soldiers trying to reach safety." As they watched, Morrison's team suddenly changed direction and began moving toward the unknown team with obvious aggressive intent. Within minutes, they had surrounded the other group and appeared to be forcing them to surrender their equipment. "We have to do something," said Tony. "They're robbing another team." But Before they could decide on a course of action, the confrontation in the valley below took a violent turn. One member of the surrounded team tried to resist, and Morrison's group responded with what appeared to be excessive force. Even from their distant observation point, Sarah could see that someone had been seriously injured. That changed everything. This was no longer a training exercise. It had become a situation where people were getting hurt. Sarah made a command decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. "We're going down there," she said, beginning to move down the ridge toward the valley. "Whatever Morrison thinks he's doing, it ends now." The others followed without question, and Sarah realized that somewhere during their 2 days in the desert, she had become the team's leader. It was a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but one she was prepared to accept. As they approached the scene of the confrontation, Sarah could hear Morrison's voice clearly carrying across the desert air. But what he was saying made no sense in the context of a training exercise. "You should have stayed out of our territory," Morrison was telling the captured team. "This isn't a game anymore. There are real stakes involved and people who don't understand that are going to get hurt." Sarah exchanged glances with her teammates. Whatever was happening in this exercise, it wasn't what they had been told to expect. And Morrison seemed to know a lot more about the real situation than the other participants. As they prepared to intervene in what was rapidly becoming a dangerous situation, Sarah felt the familiar weight of the tattoo on her shoulder blade. She had managed to keep her true background hidden during their time at Camp Resolute, but circumstances were forcing her to consider whether it might be time to reveal who she really was. The question was whether doing so would help save the injured trainee in the valley below, or whether it would create an even more dangerous situation for everyone involved. Sarah and her team moved down the rocky slope with practiced silence, using the natural terrain to mask their approach. The scene in the valley below had grown more disturbing as they got closer. Morrison's team had forced the captured soldiers to kneel with their hands behind their heads, while one of their number lay motionless on the ground, blood visible on his uniform. "This has gone way beyond a training exercise," whispered Jake as they took cover behind a large boulder about 50 yards from the confrontation. "Someone's going to die if we don't stop this." Sarah studied the tactical situation carefully. Morrison's team had positioned themselves with good fields of fire and clear sight lines in multiple directions. They were operating with professional competence that went far beyond what she had seen from them during the official training exercises. Either Morrison was a much better soldier than he had appeared, or something else was driving this encounter. "We need to know what we're dealing with before we commit," said Alex, ever the cautious sniper. "If Morrison's team has authorization we don't know about, intervening could make us the criminals." But Tony was focused on the injured man. "That soldier needs medical attention now. Authorization or not, we can't just watch someone bleed out." Klaus agreed. "In Afghanistan, we had a saying, when in doubt, save lives and sort out the politics later. That man down there could be dying." Sarah made her decision. "Alex, find a position where you can provide overwatch. Tony and Klaus work around to the left flank. I want you positioned to cut off their escape route if things go bad. Jake, you're with me. We're going to walk down there and demand an explanation." "What if they start shooting?" asked Jake. "Then Alex drops Morrison first, and we deal with the consequences later." As her team moved into position, Sarah found herself thinking about the events that had led her to Camp Resolute. The official story was that she was a helicopter pilot seeking advanced ground combat training. That story was true, as far as it went. But it wasn't the complete truth. 3 years earlier, during her second deployment in Afghanistan, Sarah's helicopter had been shot down during what was supposed to be a routine medical evacuation. She and her crew had survived the crash, but they had been stranded in Taliban-controlled territory with a critically wounded soldier who needed immediate surgery. For 6 days, Sarah had led her small group through enemy territory while carrying their wounded teammate. She had navigated using only her knowledge of the terrain from aerial reconnaissance, found water and shelter in the harsh mountain environment, and evaded multiple Taliban patrols that were actively hunting them. On the 4th day, when their situation seemed hopeless, Sarah had made contact with a different kind of military unit, special operations soldiers who were conducting their own classified mission in the area. The team leader was a man who introduced himself only as Hawk, and he had been impressed enough with Sarah's survival and evasion skills to offer her an opportunity. "You've got natural instincts for this work," Hawk had told her as his medic treated their wounded teammate. "If you're interested in doing more than just flying transport missions, there are people who would like to talk to you." After returning to base and completing her official debriefing, Sarah had been contacted by representatives of a classified program that recruited exceptional soldiers for special operations assignments. The training had been intense and secretive, conducted at facilities that didn't officially exist by instructors who used code names rather than their real identities. For 18 months, Sarah had led a double life. Officially, she remained a helicopter pilot assigned to routine support missions. But her real work involved infiltration, reconnaissance, and occasionally direct action in situations where conventional military units couldn't operate. Her codename in the special operations world was Ghost Hawk, a reference to both her flying background and her ability to move through enemy territory without being detected. The tattoo on her shoulder blade was a stylized hawk design that served as identification among members of the classified program. She had requested assignment to Camp Resolute partly to improve her conventional ground combat skills, but also because intelligence reports had suggested that someone was using NATO training facilities to recruit soldiers for unauthorized operations. Her real mission was to identify and stop whatever was happening at the camp. Watching Morrison's behavior during the survival exercise, Sarah was beginning to suspect that she had found what she was looking for. "Hawk, are you in position?" Sarah's voice carried clearly across the desert as she and Jake emerged from cover and began walking toward Morrison's group. The code name had an immediate effect. Morrison's head snapped up, and his confident demeanor suddenly became tense and alert. Two of his team members actually reached for their weapons before Morrison gestured for them to stop. "Well," Morrison said as Sarah and Jake approached with their hands visible and empty. "The mysterious pilot has some interesting friends. I was wondering when you'd show yourself." Sarah kept walking until she was close enough to see the injured soldier clearly. He was unconscious but still breathing, with what appeared to be a serious head injury. The captured team members were watching her with a mixture of hope and confusion. "Let me see to the wounded man," Sarah said calmly. "Then we can discuss whatever this is really about." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I don't think so, love. You see, this whole exercise has been a recruiting operation from the beginning. We're looking for soldiers who can handle real work, not the sanitized missions they teach you in regular military units." "Real work?" asked Jake. "Private military contracting, corporate security, government contracts that require people who can operate outside official channels. There's a whole world of opportunities for soldiers who aren't squeamish about bending rules." Morrison gestured toward the captured team. "These boys failed their audition. They had a choice: join our operation or lose their equipment and supplies. When they chose to resist, they demonstrated that they don't have the flexibility we're looking for." Sarah knelt beside the injured soldier, checking his pulse and examining his wound while keeping part of her attention on Morrison. The injury was serious, but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. "And what makes you think I'd be interested in your operation?" she asked. Morrison's smile widened. "Because you're not really a pilot seeking ground combat training, are you? The way you move, the way you handle tactical situations, the fact that you knew about those hidden water sources, you're already special operations trained." He paused, studying her reaction. "The question is whether you're here as a potential recruit or as someone sent to investigate our operation." Sarah finished her examination of the wounded soldier and stood slowly. "What if I told you I was both?" The admission seemed to surprise Morrison. He had been expecting either denial or immediate hostility, not a measured response that suggested genuine interest. "Then, I'd say you're exactly the kind of person we're looking for," Morrison replied. "Someone who understands that the real world requires flexibility and practical solutions rather than rigid adherence to official policies." Jake looked confused and concerned. Sarah, what are you talking about? Before she could answer, Alex's voice came from his overwatch position. Movement to the north. 2 vehicles approaching fast. Morrison cursed and grabbed his radio. Cleanup crew, this is team leader. We have complications at Grid Point Delta. Request immediate extraction. Sarah realized that the situation was about to become much more complex. Morrison's operation was larger and better organized than she had initially suspected. The approaching vehicles probably contained either reinforcements from Morrison's team or extraction assets to remove evidence of their activities. Jake, she said quietly, when I give the signal, get down and stay down. Morrison was still talking on his radio when Sarah made her move. The tattoo on her shoulder blade wasn't just decoration. It was also a marker for specialized training in close-quarters combat that most soldiers never received. In one fluid motion, she disarmed Morrison, swept his legs, and pinned him to the ground with a joint lock that would cause serious injury if he tried to resist. Ghost Hawk is a go, she called out loudly, using the code phrase that would identify her to any legitimate special operations personnel who might be monitoring the situation, requesting immediate support for compromised training operation. Morrison's team members reached for their weapons, but Alex's rifle cracked from his overwatch position, sending a bullet close enough to their heads to make them reconsider. Tony and Klaus emerged from their flanking positions with their own weapons ready. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah said, increasing the pressure on Morrison's arm to emphasize her point. Your team is going to provide medical attention to that injured soldier. Then, you're going to explain to whoever's in those approaching vehicles that this operation is terminated. Morrison tried to struggle, but Sarah's hold was too precise and professional. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he gasped. This goes higher than you think. We have authorization from people who outrank anyone you could call. Maybe, Sarah replied. But I doubt they authorize you to seriously injure fellow NATO soldiers during a supposed training exercise. That tends to create investigations that people in high places prefer to avoid. The approaching vehicles had stopped about a quarter-mile away, and Sarah could see armed figures dismounting and taking defensive positions. But they weren't moving to advance, which suggested that they were waiting for instructions rather than launching an immediate assault. Morrison's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Team leader, this is Control. We show complications at your location. Please advise your status. Sarah released her hold on Morrison just enough to allow him to reach his radio. Tell them the exercise is terminated and you're returning to base, she instructed. Nothing else. Morrison hesitated, and Sarah applied pressure to remind him of his vulnerable position. Control, this is team leader. Exercise terminated due to injuries. Returning to base for medical treatment and debrief. There was a long pause before Control responded. Copy, team leader. Extract to Rally Point 3 for debrief. Control out. Sarah maintained her hold on Morrison until the distant vehicles departed, taking with them whatever support he had been expecting. Only then did she release him and step back. This isn't over, Morrison said as he rubbed his shoulder and glared at her. People are going to want to know who you really are and why you're here. I'm counting on it, Sarah replied, because I'm going to want to know the same things about them. As Morrison and his team gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah turned her attention to the injured soldier and the team that had been captured. The wounded man was regaining consciousness, and his teammates were helping him sit up carefully. You probably saved his life, one of the rescued soldiers told her gratefully. Morrison's people were just going to leave him here. Sarah nodded, but was already thinking ahead to the challenges that would follow. By revealing her special operations background and terminating Morrison's operation, she had blown her cover and probably ended any chance of investigating the recruitment scheme from the inside. But she had also prevented what could have been a serious international incident if NATO soldiers had been killed or permanently injured during what was supposed to be a training exercise. Sometimes, the mission had to adapt to protect the larger objectives. As they prepared to help the injured soldier reach the extraction point, Jake approached her with obvious questions in his eyes. So, he said quietly, "Who are you really?" And what happens now? Sarah looked at her teammates, soldiers who had proven themselves trustworthy and competent during the past 3 days of challenging tests. They deserve an honest answer, even if it meant revealing information that was supposed to remain classified. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she said. "Everything I told you about being a helicopter pilot was true. But for the past 2 years, I've also been working special operations assignments under the code name Ghost Hawk. I came to Camp Resolute because someone suspected that unauthorized recruitment was taking place during NATO training exercises." She paused to check on the injured soldier, who was now walking slowly but steadily with support from his teammates. "As for what happens now, I imagine we're all going to have some very interesting conversations with people in senior leadership positions. The question is whether those conversations will be friendly debriefings or hostile interrogations." Alex emerged from his overwatch position, rifle still ready, but no longer aimed at potential targets. "Either way," he said with a slight smile, "it's been an honor working with you, Ghost Hawk." As they began the final approach to the extraction point, Sarah realized that her time at Camp Resolute had revealed more about herself than about the suspected recruitment operation. She had discovered that leadership wasn't just about following orders or demonstrating individual competence. It was about making difficult decisions under pressure and accepting responsibility for the consequences. The tattoo on her shoulder blade had marked her as someone with special training and capabilities. But the events of the past few days had shown her that her real strength came from the ability to work with others and make decisions based on protecting people rather than advancing her own interests. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it with the same team that had proven themselves in the desert. They had started as strangers brought together by chance, but they were ending as a unit forged by shared challenges and mutual trust. The extraction point was visible in the distance now, marked by the vehicles and personnel that would take them back to Camp Resolute. Sarah knew that her secret mission was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. But she also knew that she wouldn't be facing the next phase alone. The extraction point was buzzing with activity when Sarah's group arrived with the injured soldier and the rescue team. Medical personnel immediately took charge of treating the wounded man, while Colonel Anderson and his staff began conducting preliminary debriefings of the various teams that had completed the survival exercise. Sarah noticed that Morrison and his team were conspicuously absent from the group of returning trainees. Their early departure for medical treatment and debrief had apparently taken them to a different location entirely. That absence would certainly raise questions, but for now, Sarah was focused on helping her teammates and the soldiers they had rescued navigate what promised to be a complex situation. "Martinez," Colonel Anderson called out as she finished giving a brief statement to one of his assistants. "Report to my office immediately, and bring your team." The colonel's office was housed in a large command tent that had been set up near the extraction point. Inside, Sarah was surprised to find not only Colonel Anderson, but also several other senior officers she didn't recognize. One in particular caught her attention, a tall, lean man in naval uniform whose bearing screamed special operations. His uniform bore no insignia beyond his rank, which was commander, but there was something familiar about his appearance. "Gentlemen," Colonel Anderson said as Sarah and her team filed into the tent, "this is the team that reported the unauthorized activity during the survival exercise." The naval officer studied Sarah intently as Colonel Anderson made introductions. "Commander Hawkins, Joint Special Operations Command. Commander Peterson, NATO Intelligence. Major Williams, Military Police Investigation Division." Each officer nodded as they were introduced, but Commander Hawkins never took his eyes off Sarah. There was something in his expression that suggested recognition, though she was certain they had never met. "Ms. Martinez," Commander Hawkins said finally, "would you mind removing your shirt?" The request was so unexpected and inappropriate that Sarah's teammates immediately bristled. Jake stepped forward, ready to object, but Sarah raised a hand to stop him. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I think I know what this is about." Sarah turned around and lifted the back of her uniform shirt, revealing the distinctive tattoo on her left shoulder blade. The design was elegant but unmistakable, a stylized hawk with wings spread, rendered in black ink with subtle shading that created an impression of movement even in the still image. Commander Hawkins drew in a sharp breath, and his professional composure cracked for just a moment. When Sarah turned back around, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. "Ghost Hawk," he said quietly. "We've been looking for you." Sarah's teammates exchanged confused glances, but she could see understanding beginning to dawn in Colonel Anderson's expression. "You know who she is?" the colonel asked. Commander Hawkins nodded slowly. "Ghost Hawk is a legend in special operations circles. For the past 2 years, someone operating under that code name has been conducting classified missions that most people thought were impossible. Single-operator infiltrations behind enemy lines, extraction of high-value targets from secure facilities, intelligence gathering in areas where conventional assets couldn't operate." He paused, studying Sarah with a mixture of respect and wariness. "The problem is, Ghost Hawk's operations have been so classified that most people in the special operations community weren't sure if the person actually existed or if it was just a code name used by multiple operators to maintain security." Colonel Anderson frowned. "If Ms. Martinez is involved in classified operations, what is she doing at a NATO training facility?" "That's what we're here to find out," said Commander Peterson from NATO intelligence. 3 months ago, we began receiving reports that someone was using NATO training exercises to recruit soldiers for unauthorized private military operations. The activities you observed during your survival exercise fit the pattern we've been investigating. Major Williams opened a thick folder and spread several photographs across the table. Sarah recognized Morrison and his team members, but there were also pictures of other soldiers she didn't know. "Morrison was the tip of the iceberg," Major Williams explained. "We've identified at least 12 NATO training exercises over the past 2 years where similar recruitment activities took place. The operation is sophisticated and well-funded, with connections to several private military contractors and what appear to be government agencies from multiple countries." Commander Hawkins was still studying Sarah intently. "The question is whether Ghost Hawk was here to investigate the recruitment operation or to be recruited by it." Sarah had been expecting this moment since she revealed her identity to stop Morrison's activities. "I was assigned to investigate," she said simply. "My cover was blown when I chose to protect the injured soldier rather than maintain my undercover status." "Assigned by whom?" asked Commander Peterson. Sarah hesitated. The special operations program that had recruited and trained her was so classified that she wasn't sure these officers had the appropriate clearance levels. But their presence and knowledge of her activities suggested that the situation had escalated beyond normal security protocols. "Task Force Nightshade," she said finally. "Deep cover intelligence, gathering for situations that require complete operational security." Commander Hawkins sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs. Task Force Nightshade was disbanded 18 months ago after a security breach compromised several operations. No sarari plaiv. Task Force Nightshade was officially disbanded. The actual operations continued under different administrative cover. "I've been active the entire time, conducting missions in Syria, Somalia, and Eastern Europe." The tent fell silent as the implications of Sarah's statement sank in. If she was telling the truth, it meant that a classified special operations program was continuing to function without official authorization. If she was lying, it meant that someone with exceptional special operations skills was operating as a rogue agent. "Can you prove your claims?" asked Major Williams. Sarah reached into her gear bag and produced a small device that looked like a standard military radio, but was clearly modified with additional components. "Direct communication linked to my control officer," she explained. "Encrypted, satellite-based, completely secure." She activated the device and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Ghost Hawk to control. Authentication request for current location and audience." The response came within seconds, in a voice that was electronically altered to prevent identification. "Ghost Hawk, this is Control. Authentication confirmed for NATO debrief with Anderson, Hawkins, Peterson, and Williams. Mission parameters have changed. Full disclosure is authorized. Commander Hawkins looked like he had seen a ghost. Jesus Christ, he whispered. You're really her. Sarah deactivated the communication device and returned it to her bag. The Ghost Hawk operations have been necessary because conventional special operations units can't always respond quickly enough to time-sensitive intelligence opportunities. My cover as a helicopter pilot allows me to access locations and situations that would be impossible for someone with an obvious special operations background. Colonel Anderson had been listening quietly, but now he leaned forward with obvious interest. How many people know about your real identity? Including my control officer and communication support team, fewer than a dozen people worldwide. My teammates here learned about it during the survival exercise when circumstances forced me to reveal my capabilities. Jake, Tony, Alex, and Klaus had been standing quietly throughout the briefing, but now Jake spoke up. Sir, if I may ask, what happens to us now? We've seen and heard things that are obviously classified. Commander Hawkins and Major Williams exchanged glances. That depends, said Major Williams, on whether you're interested in continuing to work with Ghost Hawk on an expanded investigation. Sarah was surprised by the offer. Expanded investigation? Commander Peterson opened another folder containing maps and organizational charts. The recruitment operation you disrupted here at Camp Resolute is part of a much larger network. We've identified similar activities at training facilities in Germany, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Someone is systematically recruiting elite soldiers from NATO member countries for purposes that remain unclear. The concerning part, added Commander Hawkins, is that many of the recruited soldiers have subsequently disappeared from their regular military units. Some have shown up working for private military contractors in conflict zones, but others have simply vanished without explanation. Sarah studied the maps and charts, noting the scope and sophistication of the operation. You want me to infiltrate the network. We want you to find out who's running it and what their ultimate objective is, said Major Williams. Your cover is blown here at Camp Resolute, but Ghost Hawk's reputation in special operations circles might actually be an asset for this mission. Colonel Anderson cleared his throat. What about my training program? If these recruitment activities have been taking place during official NATO exercises, it raises serious questions about security and oversight. Your program will continue, Commander Peterson assured him, but with enhanced security measures and additional oversight. We can't afford to shut down legitimate training operations because criminals are exploiting them. Sarah looked at her teammates, who had proven their competence and loyalty during the past few days of testing. If I accept this mission, I want these 4 soldiers assigned as my support team. They've demonstrated skills and judgment that would be valuable for the investigation. Commander Hawkins raised an eyebrow. You're proposing to operate as a 5-person team rather than a single agent? The network we're targeting is too large and sophisticated for a single operator to investigate effectively, Sarah explained. A small team with diverse skills will be more flexible and capable than one person working alone. Major Williams consulted his notes. Martinez, Russo, Chun, Petrov, and Fisher all have exceptional service records and appropriate security clearances for this level of operation. From an administrative standpoint, it could work. As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the transformation she had undergone since arriving at Camp Resolute. She had come expecting to improve her ground combat skills while conducting a routine investigation. Instead, she had discovered capabilities and leadership qualities she hadn't known she possessed. The mocking and skepticism she had faced from Morrison and others seemed insignificant now. They had seen a helicopter pilot seeking ground combat training, but they had failed to recognize the special operations veteran hidden beneath that cover identity. Their prejudices and assumptions had made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of infiltration operation Sarah had been conducting. There's one thing I need to know, said Commander Hawkins as the briefing began to wind down. During your operations as Ghost Hawk, have you encountered any indication that this recruitment network might be connected to foreign intelligence services? Sarah considered the question carefully. Nothing definitive, but some of the operational patterns suggest professional intelligence training. The people running this network understand military culture, security protocols, and recruitment psychology better than typical criminal organizations. That's what we were afraid of, said Commander Peterson. If foreign intelligence services are recruiting NATO soldiers for their own purposes, it represents a significant security threat that goes far beyond simple criminal activity. As the meeting concluded, Sarah and her teammates were given new orders that would take them far from Camp Resolute. They would be investigating the recruitment network under deep cover, with resources and authority that went far beyond what typical military units possessed. But as they prepared to leave the command tent, Commander Hawkins pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I serve in Afghanistan during some of the operations credited to Ghost Hawk," he said quietly. "I commanded a SEAL team that was extracted from an impossible situation by someone who appeared out of nowhere, eliminated a dozen enemy fighters in less than 2 minutes, and then vanished before we could even see their face clearly." He paused, studying her with newfound respect. "I've been wondering for 2 years who saved my men that night. Now I know." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but didn't reply. Some operations were better left as legends rather than detailed after-action reports. "One more thing," Commander Hawkins added as she prepared to leave. "When this investigation is complete, there are people in Washington who would very much like to meet you officially. Your capabilities and achievements deserve recognition beyond the classified community." As Sarah rejoined her teammates and prepared for their new mission, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had arrived at Camp Resolute as Sarah Martinez, helicopter pilot seeking additional training. She was leaving as Ghost Hawk, special operations legend, leading a classified investigation that could affect the security of multiple nations. The tattoo on her shoulder blade had initially been just a mark of identification for a secret program. But it had become something more, a symbol of capabilities that went beyond what others expected from her appearance and background. Morrison and his followers had underestimated her because they saw only what they expected to see. She wouldn't make the same mistake with the network they were now tasked to investigate. The people running the recruitment operation were clearly sophisticated and dangerous. Defeating them would require all the skills and determination that had made Ghost Hawk a legend in special operations circles. But as she looked at Jake, Tony, Alex, and Klaus, soldiers who had proven themselves worthy of trust and capable of extraordinary teamwork, Sarah felt confident that they would succeed in their mission. They had been forged into an effective team during their trials at Camp Resolute, and now they would face an even greater challenge together. The mocking she had endured during her first days at the camp seemed like a lifetime ago. Those who had dismissed her as just another pilot would be surprised to learn what she had actually accomplished during her time there. But then, again, the best operations were the ones that nobody ever heard about. As they departed Camp Resolute for their new assignment, Sarah touched the tattoo on her shoulder blade and smiled. Ghost Hawk was about to become very busy indeed.